Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Jennifer Church. She is a professor of philosophy at Vassar College in New York. Her research addresses various topics in the philosophy of mind. She is the author of Possibilities of Perception and the book we're going to focus on today, Why It's Okay to Be of Two Minds. So, Dr. Church, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with a basic question, I guess. What does it mean to be of two minds?
Sure. It's not a technical term. I
Yes.
think we have two minds, though, basically means you have two different perspectives or outlooks on a particular situation. And those two outlooks are in conflict with each other, and yet they're held simultaneously. So you might go into a medical challenge with both hope and a sense of despair. And those are conflicting orientations to the same situation, but you can sometimes hold those two next to each other simultaneously. Of course, the same hope versus despair about the political situation or the geological situation or whatever. Another example would be with regard to a particular person. You experience them as a loving person, but you also experience them as resentful. And you hold both pictures of them and experiences of them alongside each other at the same time. So that's the basic idea of being of two minds.
So I think you've already given us some examples of what that means. So since you work mostly in the philosophy of mind, does having two minds necessarily mean double consciousness or not?
No, I like to use both terms, but neither of them exactly gets the intersection that I'm most interested in. So let me say a little bit about that. The term double consciousness now, I think for most people, is very much associated with Du Bois' work on the souls of Black folk. And that has the double consciousness being one of an oppressor and one of the oppressed. It's kind of a Hegelian notion, master-slave mentalities or something. And that's narrower than what I want to use it for, because it doesn't have to be that kind of hierarchical and that culturally deep issue. Also, for Du Bois, the views were really the double consciousness is a view of oneself. So do you see yourself as, lazy and worthless, or do you see yourself as wild and whatever, two different kinds of views. And I want it to be broader than that. I think it's views of the world, views of lots of situations other than just yourself. But what I do take from double consciousness and why I like that term is because I'm interested in cases where the two minds are very broad and pervasive. They cover more than a certain medical situation you go into, for example, or my experience of a particular person. I'm interested in the ways in which we carry different frameworks that are opposed. Almost all of us do certain cases which are pervasive and powerful, and I want to defend, at least in many contexts, preserving that doubleness.
But can it be that at least sometimes when we hold two different perspectives on the same subject, perhaps not, this is not a very good example, but for example, when we have conflicting emotions, could it be that one of those perspectives, or let's call it minds, could be more subconscious and the other one more conscious? Could it work that way sometimes or not exactly?
Certainly that happens. I'm sure we often have an ongoing conflict between our conscious and unconscious or subconscious minds. Insofar as I'm trying to help validate and defend it, it's kind of a moot point when one of them is subconscious, assuming in that case we don't really have control or access over it. But sometimes I think it's helpful to bring something that's subconscious into consciousness and then keep a doubleness there. So as you know, one of the kinds of cases I talk about is the contrast between a present self and a past self. And certainly we carry subconsciously the traces of past self with us, which can conflict with the present one. But the cases I'm interested in are ones where that memory of the past is live enough so I carry it with me consciously alongside each other, and the tension is something I'm aware of.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, do people tend to deal badly when there's some sort of, when they hold in their mind two different perspectives on the same thing, being it perhaps different opinions on the same subject, or conflicting emotions, or even different senses of self, comparing their present self with their past self or something like that?
Is your question is, do they deal badly with that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, if they really need a sense of internal coherence, let's say.
My interest is in resisting the elimination of those conflicts. So okay. I know there are risks. It's certainly uncomfortable, and in some cases it can be paralyzing or very painful. But in lots of important cases, I think it's good to accept and kind of embrace the advantages of having some conflicting perspectives in place simultaneously, so to speak. I think some people are better at it than others. Another kind of conflict that I'm interested in, as you know, is between a narrow perspective and a wide perspective on things. And I think some people have a very hard time attending to the particular present immediate, plus keeping in mind a much broader point of view. I think it's a virtue when you can do those two things. And I don't think it can be resolved by saying, well, somehow you have this neat in-between perspective. I think they're two genuinely important, powerful perspectives. But sure, I think some people have an easier time than others. Mm-hmm. And also for some it's more painful than for others. It's not just a matter of ability, it's a matter of what we can tolerate.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say are some of the most positive effects we can get by being able to deal with the conflict by not eliminating it?
Generally, what I think is that the perspectives that most interest me are perspectives that have are revealing of truths, of some important truths, are enlivening and intensifying of life itself. And if you try to eliminate one or the other, or try to combine them in some neat little in-between, you actually lose some of the information, and you lose some of the vitality of living. I mean, take the example of present versus past lives. My past life was a very real, live one that had certain kinds of perceptiveness, certain kinds of illumination that the present doesn't. The future will have its different strengths and weaknesses. And to simply kind of block that out either forget it or try to blend it into the present or subsume it or discount it, different ways that people try to make it a single perspective, is to kind of cut off both from part of what one's life is and has been and its energy, but also to lose some information that came from a different perspective or different focus.
Mm-hmm. So in your book, you talk about three different models, the juggler model, the isometrics model, and the disruptor model. Could you explain what are these models and what exactly do they apply to?
Sure. They're models of ways I wanted to suggest, so they're kind of images, hopefully somewhat helpful or inspiring images of how to keep competing perspectives live simultaneously in a way that's more helpful, more comfortable, more graceful than just feeling frozen and at odds with oneself. So the juggler model is really one that says you, like a juggler, you keep different balls in play. So I keep in play being, a Midwesterner and being an East Coast person, and those have different kinds of perspective. But they're both in play, or it's more poignant with different cultures, a Mexican American, very different views that conflict at certain point, but you adopt almost a playful attitude. They stay in play with each other. The isometric model or image is really, one where you intensify the pull against each other, and thereby strengthening both poles. So I think the case of sometimes, let's go for a second to the narrow-wide perspectives. There, I think if you have a narrow perspective on a particular task or moment and it seems crucially important and vivid and engaging, but alongside it you have a much wider perspective where it's really pretty small in the larger scheme of things, quite insignificant, looks very different. And sometimes those two perspectives, being aware of the contrast, strengthens both of them. Virginia Woolf talked about writing as World War II is approaching. And she said, how can I think it matters to be writing like this, given what's happening and about what's looming in Europe? And yet, she says, in some ways, the two intensify each other, and I can identify with that. The very fact she's writing like this increases the apprehension, but the apprehension also increases the sense that this is important right now here. And I think at its best, the narrow and wide views that we live with strengthen each other by juxtaposing them. And that's different than juggling. It's not like I kind of keep a wide view and a narrow view. It's like put them sharply in contrast with each other. Feel that pressure. So that's the isometric view. And then the third one I talk about is the disruptor view. It's a kind of anarchist impulse where you say, here's my view, but let's not get too complacent. Let's not succumb to whatever the dominant view is in my mind or in the culture. Throw in a conflict there. And I think a case where that is often appropriate in my mind is cases where we carry somebody else's voice with us, someone that we don't agree with, a friend who has quite a different view of things, and kind of keeping their voice live as a little disrupting of one's own complacency or self-confidence makes one humbler and wiser, I hope. Yeah. So those are the three models. And I think in some cases, one is more appropriate. I mean, one style, you might say, of carrying two minds is more appropriate than others. But in the book, I kind of explore those different models with respect to different cases of double consciousness or two-mindedness.
Mhm. So at a certain point there, you mentioned the example of when we carry sort of the voice or perspective of another person we are attached to or very close to in our minds. Do you think that in that specific case, the fact that we are especially attached to them is what really makes a big difference, or perhaps it could have sort of the same effect even if we weren't that close to that particular person?
In some sense, I think we have to be close in order for it to be a case of two minds. If I just read in the newspaper about someone else's view, it's not going to set up the same intensity of conflict, and it's not going to have the same lastingness. So, as I said, what I'm interested in anyway are the two-mindedness or the double consciousness where it's significant and pervasive and lasting. So, sure, we could read something in the newspaper and say, well, that's kind of interesting. That'll provoke me to think about something in a different way. But I'm not going to then walk around in two minds in the longer term, more significant sense. Now, I think the obvious cases are cases where I call it we've internalized another person. Most of us have internalized a parent in some way, but we also internalize people that have meant a lot to us and we've been able to sympathize with. It's not just that the person means something to us, it's that we've stepped in their shoes somehow, mentally we've empathized. And so I think that's a case where keeping someone else's perspective in mind, it might not be one's own perspective, and yet it's a part of oneself, it is an important kind of double consciousness that I want to advocate for. Does that answer your question? I wasn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes, it answers. So, just going back for a second to when earlier you mentioned the fact that sometimes there's a conflict between our present self and some sort of version of a past self of ours. I mean, what do you mean exactly by that? I would like you to explain a little bit better what sort of conflict might arise in that case and where does it stem from? Because, for example, I myself can imagine very easily that when I was a child, an adolescent, even an early adult, I had a different sense of self than I have now, and I can think about that, but it doesn't necessarily lead to conflict. So,
Sure.
could you explain that?
Yeah, I think the conflict comes up when you can actually reactivate an older view.
Okay.
And a kind of simple, more trivial example I'll give first, and then we can talk about something more significant, but one that is very real to me is listening to certain pieces of music. I can sometimes say, well, I used to like that piece of music, I don't now, but it's not setting up any particular inner conflict unless I can actually remember how I experienced it in the past.
Mm.
So I can actually recall the way that Black Sabbath sounded to me, way back as a teenager. And that isn't my now experience of hearing that music, but I can call up the previous way and it sits in contrast with the present way. And I think I'm better for being able to recall that. It doesn't mean I revert to the past, but it's like both have some something to show for them. Both are revealing and both enlivening in parts of me. Okay. So then somewhat more significant example might be about past where I was religious and now I'm not. Or a view I had of philosophy or of work, and it's changed. And I don't want to invalidate or lose it. There's certainly some aspects I can say, I was mistaken about that. But there are other aspects that are just different perspectives on the same activity, both of which are worth keeping, and there's no neat resolution or compromise that preserves what's important about the two. So those are some examples.
Do you think that the same thing could happen with future selves? I mean, when we try to think or imagine how we could be in the future, or even more particularly so when we would like to change in certain ways and are trying to projecting into the future that we want to be a person with this or that trait that we don't have at the moment, let's say?
I think it is possible, but it's much harder. With the past, we have memory that we can conjure it up again, and there's certain triggers we can use to bring back something we actually experienced. Whereas in the future, it's got to be entirely imaginative. And I think there are ways to make that imagining rich and actually become a perspective. We can extrapolate from physical or mental changes, let them go further and try to picture that. But I think it's much less perfect. I think it's worth doing, but it's less likely to hold a grip on us.
What about when more generally people sometimes project fantasy into reality? Do you think that's a problem or not?
The obvious answer is sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. There's a lot of just play that's pretty innocent and fun and unproblematic. There's a lot of, what do I want to say, kind of totally off the wall conceptions, fantasizing what, where it's dangerous, personally or politically or whatever. But I think that there are cases where it's actually very positive and useful. And again, starting with a trivial example, it might be that I imagine my car as an animal. Okay. Well, that gives me a certain connection to it. It makes me care for it in a certain way. I don't actually think my car is an animal, but I think that can be not only okay, not dangerous, but actually helpful in functioning. More significant and in the philosophical literature is considering things as if, when do I live as if such and such? Maria Mitchell says, live as if you're going to die tomorrow. And what does that mean? What is its value? Or there are cases where you say, well, act as if people have free will. And I think those cases can be actually, more significant and more pervasive than my car is an animal, but they have some of the same character. Like overlay your experience with this conception, knowing that it's not, or believing I'm not going to die tomorrow, or believing that there isn't free will in the way that I usually like to experience it as, and yet thinking it's a good framework for functioning.
Yes. So I mean, another question then. What is the role that things like laughter and surrealism might play when it comes to dealing with these sorts of inner conflicts of basically having two minds?
Hmm. Um, the laughter discussion in the book really comes up in the narrow versus wide contrast. And it's not the only kind of laughter, but lots of laughter turns on the kind of mismatch between a narrow view of something and a wider view of it. And I think of the laughter as being kind of like the juggling model or the juggling image. You know, you kind of rock back and forth. Some crying has the same character. And the writer Plesner, in a book called Laughter and Crying, emphasizes the almost shaking back and forth aspect of both crying and laughter. So I think of laughter as working insofar as you're keeping both perspectives in mind. And I think there are different kinds of laughter, but it's a nice example of that I think people can relate to is how it feels to juggle
Hmm.
perspectives, and in a way that acknowledges both and has some grace about it. Um, Similar though with laughter about the parts of me that still carry a parent mentality within me. They can cause me to laugh. In a sense, I'm laughing at myself, but I'm laughing with myself. Um, so that's the laughter um, relevance here, I think. But you mentioned the other one, I think is in the same chapter, talk of surrealism. And there, it's again a juxtaposition between what seems like normal and not normal, or rational and not rational. Um, the clock that's melting, the absurdist story that goes into right down off the charts in some way. And there, if the laughter is more a case of a juggling model, then I think of the surrealist as a kind of disruptor model. And the surrealists were anarchists. It was like you throw a spin into something. You turn it upside down. You do something that disrupts the normalcy of it. And both of those, I think, are nice examples of playing with, working with conflicting perspectives of two minds in a way that can be illuminating, fun, productive. So
Yeah, right. So, and when exactly is being of two minds a problem? And I don't want necessarily to go into, for example, pathological mental conditions because I think those are obviously something bad, at least for for the people who experience them. But I mean, just in the normal spectrum, let's say.
yeah, I do think the extremes are just extremes of the same phenomena as normal. That is, um, they're the same problems taken to greater extremes. So one is just it being too painful. I mentioned that before. I mean, if you have a past life that was so traumatic that somehow keeping it live, it kind of makes your life too painful, then there's a reason not to keep it. Then it's problematic. I mean, post-traumatic syndrome, or if the person you carry within yourself was a parent who was abusive, then keeping that person live within you, keeping it, juggling with it, is just going to be too hard and too painful. Another kind of problem, which may be related but isn't always, is where you just are stopped by the conflict. You don't know what to do. You can't act because you're so much of two minds. We're not very often in the bird and ass kind of situation where we really don't know how to act for having two different perspectives. Usually one or the other dominates. But I think there are certainly cases where you go into a hospital situation and you don't know whether to be hopeful or despairing, and that can be paralyzing. You have to make a decision, but you can't because there's such a forceful contrast. And then at some point you have to go with one way or another. If it's about pulling the plug or getting a certain surgery or whatever, you can't. There's not an in between, and you can't sit with. So you want to at some point get over the two minds for at least the decision point. I think there are other cases though where it's not necessarily bad to be paralyzed. Sometimes we go into political conflicts where I wouldn't mind it if people just stayed paralyzed a little longer than they do, because it's sometimes appropriate to not act as quickly as we're inclined to. But that kind of paralysis, I think, can be a problem. And finally, this is a kind of case that maybe is more, again, related to the really pathological sorts, is if the different perspectives you have, and I'm saying of two minds, of course it could be three, it could be four, it could be five, but if the different perspectives in their own antagonism have caused each other to rigidify, then in a way nothing can grow. Nothing can evolve in light of new evidence, and you become really fixed and not paralyzed with respect to action, but paralyzed with respect to new information or evolution of a particular perspective. And that's that kind of living then in a delusion, or if it's a double delusion, they still don't have much. They've stopped each other from growing. It's like what is this a good example or not? Two twins that in uterus that can't grow because they're pushing so hard against each other.
Yes. So, I have just one last question, and since you're a philosopher, I would like to ask you if you think that being able of keeping two different perspectives in mind, being able to deal with being of two minds would be a good trait for philosophers to have.
I think it's a good trait for everybody to have if they're capable of it. I'm not sure what you think of as specific to philosophers here. I think with anyone trying to articulate or develop a theory, there's something about working with it, trying to figure out how things fit together, incorporate with each other. But I think it's always healthy to keep somehow in mind an opponent's position. And part of what most of us do in philosophy classes is, play the devil's advocate, keep things disruptive, keep a conversation going. But also within, you might say what I'm defending philosophically is the importance of holding on to certain conflicts, which I think often philosophers have not. There's a big push to have a unified view of things. Mm-hmm. I think that's an old philosophical theme, and it has a lot of reasons for it. Partly we care about coherence and we argue in order to reach some kind of outcome or resolution. So even if in practice we're playing devil's advocate, we tend to develop theories that are more unified. But you can have a overall theory, a unified theory, which includes division, which is what I think I'm trying to promote.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the book is again Why It's Okay to Be of Two Minds. I will be leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. Dr. Church, just before we go, are there any places on the internet where people can find your work you would like to mention?
I have a website under my name, and there are links to some of my papers and things. Yeah. This particular book is one that Routledge has put out as part of a series labeled Why It's Okay to Blank. And there are a number of other Why It's Okay to whatever. And they've been promoting it as a very inexpensive paperback. So it's also easy to get.
Yeah. Okay. So, Dr. Church, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for your interest in this.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. Please also consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description of the interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters Karen Litske and Blanchett, Pereira Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Henrik Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Forrest Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Bernardo Seixas, Paulo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Robert Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott, and Zachary Fish. My producers is our web, Jim Frank, Lucas Tafinia, Kian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.